Kלים Perek Zayin Mishnah Beis, and we're carrying on with the stove, with the kira. And now I'm going to talk about a little attachment to the side of the kira called a dikun or a dochon. Dochon sheyesh by beis kibul kaderos. So we have our kira, our stove, and on one side of the stove there's a small tray attached. Try and show you a picture from the Tabernas HaKelim. There is your kira with the tray. And the purpose of this tray is, after one finishes cooking, one takes the pot off the fire and puts it on the tray to cool down. So in fact, the tray is not part of the cooking process. Says the Mishnah, Tahor Mishum Kira. There's different ways of learning this Mishnah. The most basic pshat is to say that the dikun, the dochon, is actually a completely separate kli, separate tashmish from the kira itself. If the kira becomes tomei because a sheretz was hung into its toich, the dochon, although it itself is a kli cheres, and is a kli cheres which has a toich, this tray has a rim, so the dochon has its own toich. However, this kli cheres with its toich, the dochon, is completely separate from the kira. And if the kira becomes tomei, the dochon remains tor because it has its own shem of a kli cheres and they're not attached. This must be contrasted to a Mishnah which we did earlier in Perek Hey, talking about a tanur, an oven used for baking. And there was something called a tiras hatanur, and there the Mishnah said quite clearly that the tiras hatanur actually is part of the tanur and is connected to the tanur in such a way that when the tanur becomes tomei, the tira also becomes tanur. So there must be a way of distinguishing between the relationship of the tira to the tanur of Perek Hey Mishnah Gimel to the dochon and the stove of our Mishnah. And it seems there's a fundamental difference between the cooking process of a kira and the baking process. Taking bread out of the oven and putting it in on the tray so that the bread can be formed properly seems to be more part of the baking than letting the pot cool down on the side. And therefore, says the Mishnah, Tor Mishum Kira, that means if the kira becomes tomei, the dochon remains tor, it does not makabel tumah together with the kira. However, says the Mishnah, Tomei Mishum Kli Kibble. It is a Kli Kibble, in other words, it is a kli cheres in its own right, and therefore, if a sheretz is placed into its toich, it becomes tomei, separate from the kira. So we have here two separate kelim, similar to the famous case of kalmarin hamtu omois, which we mentioned at the end of Perek Beis Mishnah Zayin, when you have a kli cheres which has got two compartments, where one compartment A is completely separate from compartment B, and if a sheretz is metame part A, part B remains tor, and vice versa. And that's what we have here. The stove and the dochon on the side, separate tray with its own toich, and it's tomei mishum kli kibble. It's not tomei because it's a kira. Kira has a special din that although it's mechubar karka, it's mekabel tumah migzeres hakosov. The dochon has just got the normal, regular din of kli cheres and doesn't follow the special din of kira. Therefore, for the dochon to be mekabel tumah in itself, by itself, it can only be mekabel tumah if it is not mechubar karka. So if the dochon, which is attached to the kira, if the kira is attached to the ground, then the dochon is rendered to be mechubar karka as well, and is not mekabel tumah. But that's why the Mishnah distinguishes and says tor mishum kli kibble. In other words, it mustn't be mechubar karka under the normal rules for a kli cheres. Now we're going to deal with the actual shape of the dochon. The dochon has a rim. So here's my stove. The dochon sticks out on this side. It has little walls. Those walls create the toich. The walls around the outside of the kira, around the outside of the dochon, are called the tztodin, the sides. The rochov is that wall, that part of the tray which backs onto the kira itself. So in other words, that little small section of cheres is the wall for the stove on one side, and is also the wall for the dochon on the other side. Says the Mishnah, Stodin shaloi, when the kira becomes tomei, so of course the whole dochon is tahor. It's not tomei together with the tumas hakira. And therefore, if a person were to touch any of those walls, those outside walls of the stove, eino tomei mishum kira, it does not become tomei because the dochon has got its own identity and is tahor. However, the rochav shaloi, what about that section of wall in between the stove here and the tray here? Small thin strip of wall which forms one edge, one wall of the dochon, but it's also the part of the kira. That's called the rochav. It's obviously a wider part than the other parts of the dochon. Rabbi Meir Matayr, Rameir says that strip belongs completely to the dochon. It's like any case when you have kli cheres with two compartments. When part A becomes tomei, then the whole of part B is tahor, and even if you were to touch that section of the wall which backs onto part A, but because it is now the toich, the inside wall of part B, it belongs to part B and is tahor. However, and that's what Rameir says, same thing applies here. That strip of wall is like the stodin, belongs to the dochon completely, and therefore, by touching it, a person is not mekabel tumah. Rabbi Yehuda Metame, he differentiates. He says the whole back wall of the kira belongs to the kira and is tomei because of the kira, and therefore don't distinguish and say this little tiny strip belongs to the dochon. That tiny strip on the side is also part of the back wall of the kira, and therefore the whole back wall of the kira becomes tomei. And if the kira is tomei, then by touching, if a oichlin or mashkin were to touch any part of the back wall of the kira, even that part which forms one of the walls of the dochon, Rabbi Yehuda holds it belongs to the kira, and therefore he's matami. And the Mishnah carries on, V'chein ha'koifes hasal v'oisa al gabav kira. This word v'chein relates to the ratio, the basic concept that if you have a stove and a tray, the tray is a kli nifrod, a separate kli from the kira. Who are then, if you build a stove, you turn a basket, a kli eitz, upside down, and place or build your kira onto the sal, onto the basket. So now the sal sticks out on all sides, and the sal is used for putting the pot, take the pots off the fire, you put it there to cool. That sal, as in the case of dochon, is completely separate from the kira, and if the kira becomes tomei, anyway you touch, the sal is completely tahor, and that is actually quite a simple din, as the Baal Tanura says, Chushbon olav kira, roichav hasal boilet chutz l'doifnei hakira u'shofsim kederos al oisa hablita. One actually puts kederos on there. Despite the fact that one puts kederos on there, it's not part of the cooking of the kira, dina kedochon, and therefore is tahor. If the kira becomes tomei, the sal, the basket, remains tahor.